So today we're going to be going over a new topic which will hopefully apply to sort of the team game and individuals in the likes of how to better position yourself when thinking about how do I rotate across a map or from area to area. So we can basically look at this through this document right here. So rotation zones, I call it zoning. There's the other term which people like to use a lot, usually when they think of zoning, is lurking, but it's usually executed poorly. So I'm gonna call it zoning. I don't like the term lurking. Lurking is where you sort of sit around and you either try to make a fake or you just you're lurking. You're just sitting in the background, not doing a lot. So I call it zoning, whereas you're actively searching to zone a player out and make their life hard. Now, if there's any teams which I've done this session with before, it's going to be very similar. If there's any people here which have seen or heard me talking about rotation zones and zoning before, this is all going to be very similar to you. I basically keep this the same. I've never really updated this document because I don't feel like there's very much to update. But basically this is going to be an outline of today's lesson. We're going to talk about the explanation of zoning and positioning. We're going to list something what I call primary zones, which are basically attached, the 8 places which are attached to the site. And then we're going to talk about secondary zones. We're also going to go through the maps where it's important. I haven't got Vertigo on here as it uses a different sort of system when it comes to this, and I haven't got around to going over that yet, but we can easily go through that during the live stream. We're then obviously going to talk about secondary zones, which are what you would typically class as the lurking areas, and how to then use them to zone out. We're going to talk over the maps, and then we're going to give a couple of examples. So this is going to be part and part today with a drawing board and with in-game. So we're going to use both at the same time, hopefully. So let's just get this all set up. So I'm going to use a couple different maps today to basically talk over rotation zones. So the main maps which I'm going to use is Mirage, because this is a simple one. Everyone's usually played Mirage. It's really easy to explain the basic core concepts and then how to abuse those concepts really well as both an individual and as a team player. And then we're obviously going to go into more advanced maps. So my favorite map to explain this concept over is Nuke, because a lot of players get the idea of zoning wrong on Nuke, or just in general they get it quite wrong. So Nuke is going to be an easy map to explain more advanced on how we can basically zone the opponents out. So if you've ever heard me, as I said, if you're a player here who's ever heard me talking about zoning before or rotation cutting, then this is all going to be familiar to you. So just sit back and relax. So rotation zones. Basic explanation of what they are, and then I'll give some examples and basically how you use them. So a primary zone and a secondary zone. A primary zone is a location in which you are comfortably able to retake a site. So fairly simple explanation, but we're going to talk about this in a little bit of detail. So we'll start with drawing board and then we're going to move on to the in-game. So primary zones. I'm going to draw on a couple of different primary zones and then I'm going to explain how they work. So for Mirage, we have the stairs area, also known as jungle. This is a primary zone. We're going to talk about CT stairs. Some people like to call it CT spawn. CT stairs, that's also a primary zone. And you could potentially add in here, you could also add connector and potentially deep jungle. So these are your main sort of 4 primary zones when it comes to the counter-terrorist side. So let's deep dive into that and sort of understand it better. I mentioned here, a primary zone is a location in which you are comfortably able to retake the site. And what that means is, I mentioned, let's take jungle. So if the enemy has control of my site and I'm the counter-terrorist, let's say I've rotated in from B. Now what I want as the counter-terrorist is to have control over this area. If I have control over this box right here, basically all the way up to the top of stairs to, let's say, about here. If I have control of this area, then what I can do from this area is I can do a lot. So I can throw Molotovs, I can throw them, for example, to fireboxes, I call it, other people have different names. People call it ninja. I call it firebox. The corner. That's 2 bad mollies. I can throw smokes which land palace. I can throw, there's a smoke here which basically lands in this location here. You can also throw nades from this area. You can molly on the balcony. From this area right here, you can do just about everything. You can retake really comfortably from this area. Now, we'll look at CT again. So I've drawn also on here CT. So this is the exact same concept. If you have CT control, CT ramp control, then exactly the same stuff. You don't get as much option, but you can also use it. You can molly on the balcony. You can molly back on fireboxes. You can molly on top of the balcony. It's a little bit more difficult, but you can do it theoretically. You can smoke stairs. You can come into this location here and easily smoke T-ramp. You can molly T-ramp. You can basically nade into get ray. You can do all of this different stuff from this area, and this is why I call this a primary zone. It's really important that as a counter-terrorist, these are the areas that we want control of. If you don't have control of these areas, or potentially you've lost control of these areas, your goal is to first gain those areas back before taking a retake. Now, we'll go over to Mirage on this document, and we can see we have, for the A site, jungle, connector, and CT ramp. So these are 3 places in which primary zones exist. So if we clear this, that's basically jungle area, connector, and CT ramp. Now, I use a general rule of thumb where I say if you're a counter-terrorist and you're retaking a site, it's quite important to potentially have 2 out of 3 of these areas. And as a terrorist, you want to flip that on its head. So now you put yourself in the shoes of a terrorist. You don't want the opponents to have 2 out of 3 of those positions. So you want to try and take 1 or potentially 2 of those positions. If they have all 3, they're going to have a flawless retake. It's going to be very easy for them. If you take 2 of those areas, it's going to be incredibly difficult. The enemy are going to struggle getting into the site. Let's say you take jungle and connector. Then they're going to have to filter their rotates through the CT spawn, and they're basically going to be at a choke point. This area right here is very deadly for any rotating opponents if you have this control right here. Or they're going to have to take the incredibly long way around, either into palace or into ramp, and potentially also mid all the way around, if you have those areas on lockdown here in the middle. So 2 out of 3. That's usually what I say. You want to, as a terrorist, control 2 areas, and as a counter-terrorist, you also want to control 2 areas. So if you can always control 2 areas regardless of the side that you're playing, it's going to be very, very easy for you to take retakes. So that's a very basic explanation of primary zones. Just to touch on the subject, let's move on to secondary zones. So let me just take a quick sip of water. Is everyone happy with the primary zone explanation? Has anyone got any questions? In the meantime, I'll move on. So secondary zones. It's the rotation points between a site and a primary zone. So what I mean by this, if you're the B player, in order for you to get to a primary zone on A, so either connector, ramp, or jungle, if you want to get to one of these 3 connections, you either have to rotate through spawn, or again through spawn, or potentially mid to connector, or window through mid to connector. So what you have is you have these areas, and I call these secondary zones. So we can basically remove all this, or we can go for purple actually, or blue. Blue would be better. So this area is a secondary zone because you're having to move from your site down into the CT spawn. So this is what I call a secondary zone. Again, through mid, if you're having to go through the middle, then this is another secondary zone. You're having to go directly through that area in order to get to the site. And again, through this jungle control. So you've got these 3 areas which you would potentially have to rotate. You can extend this even further if you have to go through apps all the way to the A site. Then again, you could technically call this area here, or potentially even spawn, a secondary zone. It's the area in which you're moving from your site to the opposing primary zone. I know that's pretty complicated, but the basic take from it is primary zone attached to the site where you take a comfortable retake. Secondary zone, it's the place in which you pass through in order to get to the opposing site to make the retake. So they're the two things which there are. So I'll show you in game basically secondary zones again. So the example I gave, if you're the B player, you want to rotate through the secondary zone of spawn. This is, you're now in the zone in which you're rotating through to get to the opposing site. So moving through this area, this is your secondary. If you go through connector, for example, again, this area right here becomes your secondary. If you're going through mid, then this area from mid becomes your secondary. So all of these areas are basically what I call secondary zones. And what we're going to talk about a bit later on is how we can abuse those and abuse primary and secondary zones together to basically dominate the CT side when you're on terrorist, or if you flip it on its head, if you're the counter terrorist, how you dominate these areas in order to basically disrupt whatever the terrorists want to do. So if they want to take a site and defend it, if you have access to all of your secondary zones, you have access to all of your primary zones, it's going to be incredibly easy for you to retake that site. They're going to have no problem at all retaking, getting into the site and getting that defuse. So primary zone. So let's talk about some very, very simple uses. So I've got it down here in writing. What we're going to do is I'm just going to talk through it, and I'm going to show you in game. That's the easiest way I can do it. If you want to read, if your English is proficient and you can read that, go ahead. But basically the uses of zones as a counter-terrorist, when you're choosing either to play a retake on a site, then your primary objective as the anchor, or for example a rotator, is to secure the most valuable primary zone, so the rotation zone. Now what I mean by this, let's say you're playing connector, I'm playing connector, I'm sort of holding mid, and all of a sudden there's an A execute. Now for me, as the connector player, the closest area that I can secure, which is going to allow my team to have a better retake, is connector, or potentially jungle, depending on what smokes the enemy throw. If, for example, the enemy throw this smoke right here, which, if anyone doesn't really know, you can look back in the VOD how to throw this. You come into this corner right here, you line up to the top of this antenna line, and then you basically just throw it, let go with a jump bind. A jump bind you'll have to Google yourself. You'll have to add a script to your config. But basically, if the enemy were to throw this smoke, for example, then connector is my closest zone that I want to secure. And the reason why I want to secure this is because if I have this, then as I showed you earlier, I can throw all of my utility from here. So I might not necessarily want to jump through that smoke and just start fighting the site. If I die, my teammates are going to have a hard time. Potentially the enemies could take connector control, and now my teammates have a really hard time retaking that site. So it might be valuable for me to hold this. Now if they were to throw, let's say, a very standard set of smokes, which is a smoke here for jungle, cross, and a smoke for stairs, very standard smokes that you see thrown all the time, then now the most valuable area for me in the primary, for the most valuable primary zone would be for me to keep jungle control. And that means if I have jungle control, I don't push through the smoke like a hero and try to get the kills on. I just instead sit in this area and defend it from anyone who's potentially, you're having enemies, pop flashing through and trying to get kills. If you just sit back here and wait for the opponents to come through their smoke and you defend this area, then you have control of your primary zone, and that's really important, as we mentioned before. So going back to the explanation, secure your closest and most valuable rotation zone, which is usually the primary zone, so that your teammates will have somewhere to retake from when they complete their rotation. Really simple concept. Players don't like to do this. A lot of players, when they see an execute, they start throwing all the utility. They throw a molly into default to try and stop the plan. They might just throw a molly here just to stop players from pushing up. They might flash through the smoke and try and get some kills. Like whatever it is, you got to think: do I keep my utility and use this at a later time when it could be more valuable and defend my rotation zone, or do I try to be a hero and potentially lose my rotation zone, which is going to stop my teammates from being able to have a successful retake? And this is the sort of the balance that you need to develop as a player. Do I go for a hero play, or do I play for the team? Now, This doesn't always just apply for team games, but this also applies in things like Face It, matchmaking, whatever it is. If you're playing as an individual, you need to think of these things as well. Now let's move on. If you hear the term retake, this is going to really apply for you. At all costs, listen to the call of retake, either during practice or if you hear it during an official or during matchmaking or during Face It. It's really important that you sort of listen to that retake call. So if somebody says, oh, I'm playing retake, then it wouldn't be very smart for you to fucking jump through the smoke and just go pedal to the metal and try and get kills and stuff. Because what that means is, if someone wants to play retake, let's say the A anchor, he's playing ramp, and they do this smoke right here. It's not valuable anymore for him to try and fight. It will be valuable for him to keep hold of the position, so he might want to fall back a little bit. And he might want to call, I'm playing retake. So he's locking down his position. Now if you, as the connector player, decide, okay, I've heard retake, I'm just going to go for it anyway and try and get some kills, just because, then you potentially could lose this area. And as I said, as a terrorist, you want 2 out of 3 of those potential retake zones. So if you lose your area, well, they've already got 1 zone. All they would have to do is push a little bit further. So if they get control of this area, they would just have to push here, push here. They're going to absolutely cripple your potential to retake. So if you hear the term retake during practice, whatever it is, always listen to it. It's important to practice efficiently in this regard. And even if you believe playing retake isn't the best option, follow the call anyway. It's vital to practice it. It's better to follow a call if you feel like it's bad and then it goes bad, than to not follow a call because you feel like it's not a good call and then it goes bad. Because you don't know the potential outcome of what would have happened if you would have listened in the first place. So a little bit on communication skills right there, but the core concept, follow the retake call. Now let's talk about the opposing people. So we talked about the people who are directly attached to the site. Let's talk about the people who are on the opposite side. So we'll go into, we'll use no assist for this. As the opposing anchor, or the rotation, your goal is to secure the secondary zones before moving towards the retake site, or the next primary zone. Now, to cut the complicated words, what I mean is, you're playing short, you're in this area. In order for you to get to this primary zone right here, in jungle, you need to cross mid. Now this is very dangerous because you're crossing a secondary zone. This area right here is a secondary zone. And now why this is dangerous is, so an enemy could be in any of these positions. They could be top mid. They could be sort of towards the T side ramp in top mid. They could be lower mid. They could be in ladder room. They could be in window. They could be on the thing in the little ledge in the window. They could be on the benches. They could be underground. They could be in any of these locations. And what that means is, if you just aimlessly, as the rotation, just look top mid and then instantly jump towards connector because you think that's enough. I've cleared top mid, that's fine. Now, what could happen is the enemy might not be up here, but they might be in any of these potential places. Any of them. So it's important that as the opposing anchor, you secure your secondary zones first. So what that looks like. So I highlighted this green area. This is your secondary zone. So in my opinion, it's important to secure this area first. So what you might want to do, okay, the enemy might have gone mid early in the game, and they could have a potential player left behind, or they could have had a player, for example, in B holding and not doing anything, and then he walks slow underground towards lower mid. So you need to be aware of all these types of situations where the enemies could be in these potential areas. What you should do is, let's say your jungle player took control of this zone right here. It's secure. Okay, now maybe the next best option would be to pull this player into middle, and both of you tag team clearing your secondary zone. You want to clear this zone. Get it clear so that you know for certain there's no players there. So what that could look like, if I'm the rotating player from B, I hear the enemies are doing an execute A, then what I might say is, I might call over to, we'll just say John is the connector player. I might say, John, come clear mid with me. And what I could do is potentially go through ladder room, and John could come through connector. I could make sure this is all clear, and then peek top mid for him, for example. Double peek from connector in here, and we could both peek on like a 3-2-1 top mid to make sure it's all clear. And we could both basically check underground. Either I could fall a flashbang for him, and he could peek with that to make sure underground is clear. And then we can both then move back towards. So if, for example, I was to go for a window and then clear mid with him, and he was to come through connector and potentially clear lower mid and top mid, then we could both meet up again in jungle. So we've cleared our secondary zone, we've cleared this big blue area right here. This is our secondary zone, our mid. We've made sure there's no enemies there. We're not going to be surprised by anyone coming up behind us. We're not going to get killed while rotating over. We've made sure that that is all clear. And then we can now focus on the next big goal, the retake. So it's really important that you don't, as a player, especially as a rotating player from the opposite side, just jump through your secondary zones. You don't just come up, oh, okay, I'm going to go through a window. You just come straight through here, and then you just aimlessly walk along. Because what could happen is an enemy could be sat here. The moment you pass through the window, you're dead. You're gone. You're gonzo. And what that means is now your team's going to have a hard time defending both the middle and the site. So clearing these secondary zones is a really, really important thing. And that's basically the main example which I'll give for Mirage is you've got a rotation zone here, you've got a secondary zone here, you've got a secondary zone here. So these are all areas where enemies could potentially kill you and where enemies could potentially be. And you might think, why would an enemy be in CT spawn? Trust me, it happens from time to time. So it's best off, instead of just holding your knife out and just going straight for it, and just going straight out and trying to get to that CT as fast as you can, try and think back. Could the enemy have jumped into window? And if they did potentially jump into window, could they now be potentially hiding in, let's say, a position like this? Or could they be hiding, for example, here? Now, Brazilian teams are quite good at doing this and getting in these sort of areas. So, you need to be aware of them. Just make sure that you're on top of your guard when you're rotating. You don't just aimlessly, with your knife out, run wherever the hell you want to go. Try and think about clearing those secondary zones. Oh, back onto the examples. So, hopefully this will now be a lot easier to understand. Secure your secondary zone before moving to retake the site or to the next primary zone. It's very important to make sure the secondary zones are secure before moving forward. Otherwise, you could set yourself up to be lurked on. This is the term lurk. Basically, a lurker could come behind you and potentially kill you. And this is why clearing those secondary zones is super important. Now, if you know how to do it on the CT side, that when you rotate through those secondary zones, you have to clear them. Then, flip that on its head. Put yourself in the shoes of a terrorist, okay? Now, if you're not part of the main execute, so the guys which are attacking the site, and you find you could potentially be in a position which is going to cut off those secondary zones. Let's say you go top mid at the beginning of the round, and you get into a position like stool here. Then you can do exactly that thing which I've just told you that you have to be aware of on the CT side. You could sit here and wait, you could lurk until the enemies start rotating through those secondary zones and bang straight out and get a kill. They're going to be not expecting it, they might be peeking out here, and then you all of a sudden just jump, you hear the information, oh, they're short, and you just instantly jump out and try and get the kills. And that's where it's super important that if you understand how to do it really well on CT side, you will be able to do it really well on T side, because you know, as a counter-terrorist, what to look for. So as a terrorist, you should know what to hide from, and then how to surprise your opponent. So, I've got an example for Overpass. I think we can easily use this example because it's a pretty good example. A lot of people aren't, people which don't. I just think it's a really easy map for giving a super simple example. The reason why is because Overpass has got really basic primary zones and really basic secondary zones. The map is constructed so that basically there's 3 of each. There's 3 secondaries and 3 primaries. Now, what I'll show you is exactly that. So let's go to Overpass. Let's take the B site, for example. If you're a counter-terrorist, your primary zones are this area right here, Heaven, and Short Water. So let's exec the training.
Let's go, let's go.
So this area right here, graffiti, I'm not exactly sure what a lot of people call it. It's not graffiti, what am I talking about? Anyway, this area right here, everyone has a different name for it, so I'm not going to try and call it something specific because it will be wrong. You have short water, that's pretty standard for everyone, and heaven, that's pretty standard for everyone. So these three areas are your primary zones. As a counter-terrorist, that's what you want to know. And as a terrorist, that's also what you want to know. So as I said before, you want to try and take 2 of those as a terrorist, and you want to try and hold 2 of those as a counter-terrorist. Now, secondary zones, you have connector, you have CT spawn, and you have T spawn. That's it. There's only 3 secondary zones. And the most used one is connector. Connector is the biggest secondary zone that you want to sort of pay attention to. These are bad colors, so I'll go back over it in a couple of different ones so that we can see. Now we'll move on to our example. Now that we've got the basic fundamentals, we've got 1 secondary zone here, 1 here, and 1 here, and we've also got the 3 primary zones. So how do we use them? So let's say you're on the CT side. If the B site calls a retake, then those players move to secure the closest rotation zones. Heaven, lower, we'll call this lower. That's a good word for this. We'll call this lower. We've got heaven, lower, and short water. So you want to secure those closest zones. Heaven, lower, short water, potentially monster. The only problem is, the problem with monster, or sort of this area in general, is that it's harder to perform a retake on if you're a counter-terrorist, so it's not necessarily the best idea. Anyway, moving on. And then stay alive while holding them down. Meanwhile, players playing towards A or mid would secure the secondary zone. So how this looks is basically like this. If you're playing, let's say, from this location right here, and all of a sudden the enemy do an execute and they're about to attack the site, then what you might want to do is defend this area. Now, if you're obviously on the site, it's going to be very difficult, so you can either make the decision, do I leave the site right now and get into this area, or do I fight and try and stay alive? And if you're potentially on short, then what you could do is the exact same thing. Let's say you're holding short, and they do an execute onto site, then what you might want to do is take short water. You could fight, and you could potentially win, but this player is probably not going to help you. The player on site is potentially going to die from 4 guys coming out monster, or however the exec is obviously being thought of. So you as the short player, you might want to think, okay, let me quickly take short water because this is my closest primary zone. That will set up players rotating from A to have an easier retake. So you might want to quickly just jump into short water and try and get any kills here. You can also do it with the assist. You can also have, for example, this player throw a flash over for you. So you could throw a flash over and you could obviously peek straight with that and obviously try and get a kill with that. But the important thing is securing those primary zones. And then we said basically the players that are towards A and mid would secure the secondary zones. So if you're A and mid, if you're sort of around, let's say, this area, then your only secondary zone that you're really going to want to do, which will give you the quickest rotation to B, is basically connector. So how this will look, let's say you're playing up towards A, let's say toilets, and you're sort of holding back and you're waiting, I don't know, you could even be playing here for the entrance, the top entrance to toilets. Then what you might want to do is the moment you hear sort of, okay, B's under attack, then you might want to call the other A player, let's say he's playing long, you call him to you, and you both go secure connector control. Now what this could look like, you both basically push secure mid. This could technically also be a secondary zone, but it's not exactly where you move through to the next primary. Obviously this is attached right here, so we can't necessarily call this a secondary, but it's something you also have to be aware of. Are there players here? It's that same thing, that's that lurk. It's the same thing, they could also jump out and get a kill. So you need to be aware of that type of information. Where were the enemy playing? Could they potentially be there? Things you need to look at. But anyway, moving on. 2 players, you basically come into connector. You want to secure connector. You want to make sure there's no players connector before moving on. Typically, there's always going to be a player back here, cutting off that rotation. Super important. Cuts that secondary zone. You lurk on the opponents. You make it a nightmare for those players. You can basically do this 2 ways. You can have these 2 players work in cooperate. If you have short water, for example, you could all 3 work together to all peek at the same time. So these players could, for example, throw a flash that lands, I believe something like, no, that's not right. You can have a flash which basically lands right here, or potentially even right here as a pop flash, and then all 3 players could all peek at exactly the same time and try and get the kill. or these two players can work alone and this guy can just make sure that no one pushes short to take over this secondary zone. And that's basically simple explanation of how it looks. The primary focus of these A plays is to get to this area which is secure and move through these secondary zones here and secure them. Make sure that there aren't any players there. And once those are clear, the rotated players can work with players who have already secured their rotation zones and work to obtain basically more, obtain a site. So if this player's got this short area locked down, then these two players here can obviously come out knowing there's no problem at all. If they haven't got this area secured, then you can work with your teammates. For example, if you have guys here and you're in connector, then what you could do is you could ask for a flash which blinds anyone potentially looking from this angle. So what you could do is you could ask for, let's say, a guy to flash the door area. And what that'll do is anybody who's looking from this area right here is now going to be blind because they're going to be looking at door, and then these guys can just ball straight out and try and get the kill. So these are sort of the ways you need to kind of think about, okay, we don't have this primary zone, but we need it because we're coming through connector. So how do I use players which are already sort of in safe positions to make sure I get this area back? And that's what you need to do. You need to think about getting that primary zone, if you don't have it, that is. Moving on. If your B player is secured Heaven, Lower, and Monster, or Short Water, or it's enemy occupied, then rotating players could first secure connector and proceed to move through short waters with the assist of mollies, flashes, etc. So this is exactly what I just explained, where basically if you're in connector and you don't have short water, or for example players which are rotating through, let's say lower, and you have no lower control, but you have control here, then you could potentially ask your teammates to, let's say, it's quite often that enemy T-side players will sit in a position like this, which is an absolute nightmare. So what you could do is if you have guys short water, then you could potentially molly that area off. Obviously this molly didn't land, but you can get lineups which will basically help out. You can also throw nades, you can throw flashbangs, basically flashbang over for your teammates coming out so that they can easily just come straight out here and try and look for the kills. It's all about teamwork, using your players which are around you to secure your primary zones if they've been taken off you. Communicating and working together to take primary zones from the opponents is basically all you want to be doing. You want as many primary zones as you can before trying a full blow retake. If you can't take any, fair play, you've probably lost the site. Don't go for it. But as I said, you typically want 2 primary zones. So that's going to be your focus. If you can't get them and you only have 1, you can still go for it. It's just going to be a little bit harder. So always focus on getting 2. And then after gaining control, obviously move to attack. So that's the CT side. Is everyone happy with that CT side explanation? The general concept, you want 2 out of 3 of your zones as a counter-terrorist. If you have 2 out of 3, the retake's going to be easy. It's better to defend those than fight the site. If you find yourself in a position to defend your primary zone, for example, as I showed you with lower, if you're over here, instead of fighting and trying to get kills, the players that are coming up, if you just hold back and potentially wait, you could even smoke the bridge, which would allow you to play around this smoke, and it allows the rotation to come in. The more time you can stall, the better. So sometimes it's better just not to fight. And then you want to try and keep at least 2 out of 3 of your primary zones. In the meantime, your teammates who are rotating, if they decide they want to rotate this way, if they want to rotate through connector, if they want to rotate through spawn, then they need to make sure that they're being aware and working together to secure those secondary zones before proceeding onwards. And if they get to areas which aren't secure yet, for example short water, as I said, if you have 2 guys coming through connector, use teammates where possible to secure this primary zone. So I'll get flashbangs over, get molotovs, whatever it is. Let's say you have a guy heaven, and there's potentially a guy playing short in the, let's say this location here. Then what you could do is the heaven player is you could throw a molly if it's safe. You could bank a molly off this, which is basically means any player which is holding here is going to have to back up, which now means you can kill them from heaven, or these lower guys can potentially kill them from here. So you got to think of How do I help my teammates get into those primary zones through the secondaries? And that's basically that. It's a very simple concept, but we can take it one step further. Because there are some maps where you can really get in the head of the opponents, and this is where Nuke comes in. Just before I move on, is everyone happy? Is anyone confused? Any questions? Or are we fine with just moving on to the next set? This is where it sort of starts to get quite advanced, so we need to be aware of that now. Okay, doesn't seem like we have any questions, so let's move on. Right, Nuke. Special case map. Very, very special map because the map is divided into 2 layers. Now, this makes secondary zones really, really abusable. And this could also be the same for Vertigo. I haven't done enough research into it, but you can obviously think about this yourself. Now, what I mean is, if you know how to do this really well on Nuke, if you know how to abuse secondary zones well on Nuke, it's easy for every map after this point. Super, super easy. Now, what I mean is, let's first look at the secondary zones. There's basically 3 main ones. There's vent, so this area right here. There's the vent area, so the drop down, this sort of area, and vent. There's ramp. And there's secret. So just this little secret area. These are your 3 main secondary zones. Now, primary zones, there aren't really that many, or there aren't good ones on this map. For example, if you keep heaven control, it is very hard to do a lot from here. You can throw a couple of mollies, you can throw a couple of nades, a couple of smokes, you can do little flashbangs, like, I don't know, you can throw a flashbang which basically bounces off this and then you can peek with it. That's obviously a terrible example, but there's a couple of things you can do, but it's very difficult to do full-blown retakes on this map. What's really special about this map is the secondary zone abuse. So, let's break this down. There's 3 main rotation zones for pretty much every map, and it's the same with Nuke. Which means, if the enemy goes to one of those goes through one of those secondary zones, if the terrorists go through one of those areas, that means the other 2 areas you can rotate through, and you can be sure that the enemies didn't go through those areas. Which is a really, really simple concept. But where you basically abuse this is the terrorist side. So, if you secure one of these secondary zones, the enemies can only go through the other 2. And what you can basically do is you can formulate your rounds or where you're sort of heading to abuse this system. Let's say, you see a lot of teams nowadays, they do a smoke execute outside and they potentially push down player's secret. Now what you can be sure of is, if they haven't now rotated a guy through here or rotated a guy there, then basically they either had a guy underneath the map already, or they've rotated from the other 2 places, ramp or or vents. Now what you could do to further increase your chance that there isn't a guy underneath the map, if they haven't rotated at the beginning, is take away one of the other areas. So, if you're going outside as a terrorist side, then you can probably be sure they're not rotating through secret. So they're potentially going to rotate through one of these 2. So if you're inside, for example, let's say you're inside this area right here, then what you might want to do is, as your guys are going outside, stop them from dropping down vent. Obviously, if you're smoked off, there's not a lot you can do, but you have the information that they can be down vent. But if there isn't a smoke, then potentially you could, for example, smoke main, and you could stop players from coming into this vent area. Now what that means is, they now have to have only rotated through ramp or at the beginning of the round. Which means if they have rotated through ramp, then ramp is potentially open for them and there's no one there, or there's some form of weakness in the defense. So for example, if they rotated a guy through ramp, then that could potentially have been the heaven player. He could have dropped down and gone down through, or the heaven player's rotated across to ramp, and the player who was ramp has rotated under the map towards B, which means the player who's under the map now is potentially here or here. There's not very much chance he's going to be here because you secured vent, and he's come all the way from ramp, which means it's taken longer. So as you guys who are attacking as the terrorists, you now know, just from securing secondary zones, that the enemy either has to be in this area right here, or has to be in this area right here. And then you can basically abuse that with utility. So for example, you could line up 3 guys, and you could you could basically either triple nade like this, or you could like nade one at a time, and basically remove this guy from this angle, or you can obviously do pop flashes. You can do a flash which lands on top of the vent like this. That's a bad example. A flash which lands up top, hopefully around here, would be more preferable, and then you can peek with it. Or you can also do pop flashes which basically land right on this corner, so that as your teammates come through, they're there. You don't have to worry about vent, because vent was secured by your other teammate. And this is abusing secondary zones in order to get the round win. If you know where the enemy they could have only rotated through potentially one or none of the zones, then you either know B is completely clear, or you know that it's a very, very weak down there and potentially where the enemy is. And then we can obviously, let's say we use the same example, but instead of vent control, we now focus on abusing this secondary zone here, ramp. Now what we can do is basically, as your teammates are going outside, if you position yourself early in the round, sort of around here, now as your teammates are going outside, you basically do the exact same thing. The moment you hear a player move, bang, you're straight out. You're either jumping behind them and trying to kill them, or you're either trying to hold him there, so you could potentially be making noise and trying to fight this guy. And what that means is they potentially now haven't dropped a guy down here, which means the only other place that they could have dropped a guy is vent. And this is secondary zone abusing. This is what I call zoning. If you zone the opponents, you know where they've rotated and how they've rotated, and you know the only locations that they've rotated from. You can seriously abuse this. So if they drop a guy down vent, that means usually there's 2 guys on A. Well, now there's potentially only 1 on A, and main could be now open, because it could be the main player who's rotated down into the vent and down to B, which now means that potentially they've got a guy default and maybe a guy heaven, which means now you could theoretically go through door with flashbangs and attack the guy's heaven and default at the same time. So this is zoning. This is zoning in a nutshell. It's a very complicated process, but basically you need to think of, you can completely destroy the minds of the opponents by knowing what secondary zones they have available and taking any of them away, basically taking the ones away that you need to take away in order for the opponents to be where you want them to be. So as I said, if your guys are going ramp, if you've got, let's say you're playing 3 guys ramp, 1 guy lobby and 1 guy outside, if this guy outside secures secret control, then unless they pre-rotated a guy under, there can't be anyone rotating through secret, because he's got it secure. And if the other guy just sort of listens for information in lobby, sort of around here, then the only place they can rotate down is vent. Which means, if your guys go ramp and they get a kill, you could potentially instantly fall back, knowing that they might have dropped a guy down vent, because they definitely haven't dropped a guy down outside, and then you could all attack A. Because there's a good chance, if you attack ramp and you got a kill, then they'll rotate a heaven player, for example. They'll rotate a heaven player down to ramp and potentially hold here, which now means that they could have dropped a guy down vent, potentially. They could have left a guy up in heaven, and the second heaven guy might have gone down towards ramp to defend it. You've zoned the opponent to make them only have 1 guy on A now. So they have a guy outside, they have a guy down below who's dropped through vent, and they have a guy who's potentially dead here, which means you've got to rotate here, you've only got 1 left on A. You can then just 5 stack attack A all at once, and you zone that opponent. You're getting in the mind of the enemy, and this is where zoning is super important. If you understand how to abuse these secondary zones, and you know how to make them rotate in the areas you want them to rotate down vent to make A weak, or you want them to rotate, for example, if they have a guy outside, you want this guy to potentially rotate this way, so that outside is weaker, so that you can potentially attack from outside, or attack from A through door, for example, because now they can't obviously have a guy here watching this angle right here. So you abuse those secondary zones so that they move the players where you want them to be moved. And then, if you know how to do it on the terrorist side, as I said before, you know how to do it on the counter-terrorist side. So you can sort of understand, are the enemy zoning us right now? Are we being zoned? Now this is a common thing. People they're not aware that they're doing it, but hopefully this allows you to sort of understand, oh shit, yeah, I have been doing it. So, for example, as a counter-terrorist, instead of deciding, okay, if I drop vents right now, then could I potentially be zoned here, and could they now go back up to A and take the site straight away? You can make more of those conscious decisions, or you can be thinking, okay, they're going outside, a guy dropped down ramp, do I drop down here with the potential that an enemy could be sat here waiting? And this is where you need to think, okay, well, I'm up on site, like here, I've got a guy here as well. We could potentially both double peek into lobby at the same time. And this is where you need to use teamwork and like adapting to these secondary zones as much as you can in order to take away from the terrorists as much as you can. You don't want to let them zone you. That'll be the worst case scenario. And it's not just Nuke that this is possible, it's on pretty much every map. So if we scroll back up, let's look at train. Same concept, very, very similar concept. There's 3 rotates through pop, connector, and CT spawn are basically your 3 rotates. So I'll just quickly show this on here because it's pointless me going in a server and showing you now. Pop dog, connector, oh sorry, this whole area of connector, and CT. Apologies. If you remove pop dog, then they either come through CT towards B, this is, or they come through connector. Now what you could also do on top of that is if you secure, let's say, a guy on pop dog, and as you run into B, let's say you're running out heaven, you throw a Molotov which lands right in this position here. Or you have a guy, let's say, sat in main, and he throws a Molotov which lands right here as your guys are about to attack B. Now you're doing that exact same thing. You're cutting off this secondary zone by throwing a Molotov in this position right here. Now any enemies which did want to now rotate through connector have got to wait 5 seconds. If they're on center site and they now want to go through it, they're going to have to wait. So by sort of zoning them, lurking is essentially what you're doing. You're lurking on them, you're basically hiding until the time is right and then throwing a Molotov to cut off that rotation, which allows your guys on B to have a much safer an attack on B. You're finding where those secondary zones are, you're cutting them off completely before the enemy can even use them. And you can do this with every map. You just need to think about it for a second. You come on a drawing board, click on any map. Mirage. The enemy wants to rotate through mid. So if I sit in window, if I get myself into window, or let's say ladder room, then I can cut off this secondary zone right here really easily. I can kill basically anyone who's rotating through mid, no problem at all. And this is basically all you need to do. You need to just think, how do I zone my opponent? And when you're on the CT side, am I being zoned right now? And that's the very, very core concept of rotation zones and zoning, as I like to call it. You can call it lurking, call it whatever makes you happy, but this is the general concept. So, highlights from today, just to wrap things up. If anyone is unhappy or has any questions about anything that I've gone over, then please say now while I basically wrap this up. So, to wrap, when we're thinking about primary zones, when we're thinking about defending that site, you want, as a counter-terrorist, you basically want 2 out of 3 or potentially 2 out of 4, depending on which area of the which map it is and which site. And as a as a CT, you want 2 out of 4, and as a terrorist, you might also want 2 out of 4 or 2 out of 3. So you're at a constant battle. It's called like equilibrium battle. You want to fight to have the most primary zones. If you're terrorist and you have none, there's a good chance you're going to lose the site. If you're counter-terrorist and you have none, it's not even worth trying to retake. It's going to be so difficult because you haven't even got to the part where you can perform a decent retake. You're basically just going to have to go aim all the way out and just aim battle. That's basically your only option right now because you're going to have a hard time throwing utility. As for the secondary zones, secure the secondary zones before moving to the first ones. So always secure those secondaries. So if you see a potential teammate, for example, if it's Nuke, and you want to go down vent, but they blew off the door and they potentially have guys lobby, and you've got 2 on A site, then double peek into lobby. Even go take lobby. If you take lobby control of them, you completely stop their ability to cut you off going through vent, and you also then have information. So that's a sort of like an extra part aggressing on those secondary zones. Yeah, so securing those secondary zones and then securing the primary zones after that point. And then as the terrorist, as I said, you want to try and abuse those secondary zones. Potentially, if you're outside, for example, a Nuke, securing here. If you're in lobby, then making sure no one drops vent. If you're at ramp, then making sure no one drops ramp, or potentially killing people as they rotate off towards ramp. That's super important. And obviously, as a terrorist, it's super important to take those primary zones. So, for example, if you rush into A on Nuke and you just take the site, well, if you don't move past this point, or you don't stop enemies from coming up past this point, if they have this area here as a counter-terrorist, they have this area here as a counter-terrorist, then they can easily retake that site with a few, like a molly there, for example. They could potentially molly the entrance at the door. They could smoke off this door here. They can easily, for example, they could nade behind this vent right here to get some. It might not be a lot of damage, but having any form of control of primary zones as a counter-terrorist is damaging for a terrorist. So try and take as many of them as you can. If you can't take them, push them with utility. So if you can't take heaven, keep throwing mollies at heaven. What are they going to do? They can't come up. They're just stuck behind them. They're just going to have to sit here and wait. And it's annoying when you have to do that as a counter-terrorist. Sometimes you just get frustrated and you even go for it. So if you can't physically get up to heaven, then throw utility. If you can't take main control, again, throw utility. Either throw a Molotov or smoke it off. Just push the enemy back behind their primary zones. Get them out of there. And that's basically a wrap. That's all I've got on secondary zones. On zoning and rotation zones. It's a simple process. It will help in a couple of skills: performing retakes, performing rotations, lurking, whatever that means nowadays. I just call it zoning because that's much easier for me. And obviously understanding how to communicate better with your teammates. You can communicate pushes better if you want to push for primaries, push for secondaries, whatever it is. It helps in a whole range of skills. It's not just one single skill that this helps. This is across the board. So that's basically what I've got today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this document here in the Discord. For anybody who wants it, I will share this here. What I advise you to do is, if you go on File and you make a copy, then it will go into your drive, and then obviously if you ever want to look back, I don't know, you can translate it for yourself into Icelandic if you wish, or you can keep the examples and everything exactly the same, and try and use the VOD basically as a look back. So I will leave this in the Discord after the lesson.